Good evening, I'm Jim Lara. On the NewsHour tonight, Decision Day in New Hampshire. Mark Shields and Paul Gigot take a final look. The governor's way to reform welfare. Kwame Homan reports. Charlene Hunter-Gault talks to two governors and two critics. And the sentences in the Rodney King case go before the U.S. Supreme Court. Jeffrey Kay reports. Elizabeth Farnsworth debriefs Stuart Taylor. It all follows our summary of the news this Tuesday.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lara has been provided by the Archer Daniels Midland Company, ADM, supermarket to the world. And by New York Life, yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
Pat Buchanan won the New Hampshire primary tonight. All four television networks declared the former news commentator the victor. Here are the latest returns with 40% of the precincts reporting. Buchanan won at least 28% of the vote. Senator Bob Dole, the presumed frontrunner for the Republican nomination, came in second with 26%. Lamar Alexander ran third. Steve Forbes was fourth. President Clinton won the Democratic primary. He had no opposition. Today's turnout was a record, according to state election officials. They projected 192,000 registered voters participated in the Republican primary. That breaks all previous records. Long lines at polling places forced some of them to remain open after the scheduled 8 p.m. closing time. We'll have more about the primary right after the news summary and later tonight on the NewsHour special at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. In economic news today, the index of leading economic indicators was up for the first time in 3 months. The Conference Board, a business research group, reported the increase was 0.2% in December. And Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan said 1996 will be a good year for growth and low inflation. In his semi-annual report to Congress, Greenspan said the economy's recent weakness should prove only temporary. Also in Washington today, a House committee held the first hearing on a welfare reform proposal of the nation's governors. The bipartisan plan was adopted 2 weeks ago at the governor's annual winter meeting. They said it could resolve the long-running budget dispute between the president and the Republican Congress. At today's hearing, they drew reactions from both sides. Republicans said it was time for significant change.
I want to offer a message to my Democrat colleagues and to President Clinton. To those who have defended the state's status quo, you created today's welfare system. Believe in it, it was in best interest of our nation, and it was best interest of the poor and our needy. You had your chance. You fought your fight. The fight has been lost. You meant well, but today's Washington-run, federally controlled welfare system is a disaster. I say to you, let it go.
Democrats said the welfare system needs to be restructured, but without stripping protection from people who need it most.
We need to rebalance the partnership between the federal and state governments in this area. That's clear. The states must have larger responsibility, but that responsibility must also be blended with a reasonable measure of accountability, because the national interest is also clear: to break the cycle of dependency and births out of wedlock, and to help the children in the welfare system, not by punishing them, but moving their parents from welfare to work.
We'll have more on this story later in the program. The new leader of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, was sworn in this morning. Former Congressman Kweisi Mfume became president of the nation's oldest civil rights group. President Clinton attended the ceremony in the Great Hall of the Justice Department in Washington. At the White House, Transportation Secretary Federico Pena issued new railroad safety rules. They restrict the speed at which a passenger train may leave a station, among other things. The new regulations follow by 4 days a rail crash and fire that killed 8 passengers and 3 crew members in Silver Spring, Maryland. A commuter train collided with Amtrak's Capital Limited at a speed twice as fast as it should have been going. Pena said the rules go into effect at midnight tonight.
You will see 4 things done. Number 1, the rule that says that the train will proceed with caution when it comes into a station or slows down under 10 miles an hour applies immediately. The requirement to call signals out from the engineer to the conductor is also an immediate application. The requirement to check all the emergency exits and make sure that they are working is an immediate requirement. And they're planning to submit the proposal to submit a plan to us within 45 days, of course, takes effect now. The 45 days are ticking.
At the Supreme Court today, justices heard arguments in a case stemming from the beating of Rodney King 5 years ago in Los Angeles. At issue are the prison sentences of 2 L.A. police officers convicted of violating King's civil rights. We'll have more on this story later in the program. The Oklahoma bombing trial was moved to Denver today. A federal judge said the change of venue was necessary to guarantee the defendants a fair trial. He agreed with defense lawyers that intense media coverage made a fair trial impossible in Oklahoma. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols face federal charges of murder and conspiracy for last April's bombing that killed 169 people, injured more than 500. In Bosnia today, Serbs fled the suburbs of Sarajevo after their leaders ordered them to evacuate rather than live under a Muslim Croat government. Dozens of trucks and cars began the exodus. There are an estimated 50,000 Serbs currently living in the Bosnian capital. The Bosnian peace accords call for Sarajevo to be unified under the control of the Muslim Croat Federation by next month. That process was already beginning in the city of Mostar today. Free movement was allowed between Croat and Muslim sections of the city for the first time, but it broke down after an hour with the two sides demonstrating against each other. And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to some last overview words from Shields and Gigot on the New Hampshire primary, welfare reform, and the Rodney King case before the U.S. Supreme Court. The polls are closing in New Hampshire, and soon the results, and thus the Republican winners and losers, will be known in the first primary of the presidential election season. We go to Shields and Gigot now for some closing overview thoughts about it all. Syndicated columnist Mark Shields, Wall Street Journal columnist Paul Gigot. First, Paul, was this the meanest New Hampshire primary in recent history, as everybody says it was?
I think that our memory about meanness tends to fade with time, like all bad memories. And I think that we overestimate in the current round of any given political race the meanness that goes on now. There's no question that there's been a lot of rough stuff here.
Rough stuff beyond the pale, rough stuff that was too much?
Now, I think that where it did go beyond the pale was there were some lies told. I think that Bob Dole in particular, the ad he ran about Steve Merrill's flat tax, Steve Merrill ran, the governor of New Hampshire ran about the study, was based on a study about the flat tax, which simply wasn't true. There were some of those excesses taken. But I think this is, other than the fact that a lot more of this appeared on television, I think that this was not all that much more unusual than a lot of other primaries in the past.
So when we go from this New Hampshire primary, it will not be remembered. Oh, remember New Hampshire, 1996. That was the meanest New Hampshire primary of all time. You don't think that will be remembered? That will be the way it'll be remembered?
I don't remember William Loeb and the Union leader back playing beanbag, and I remember when Nelson Rockefeller beat the heck out of Barry Goldwater, and there was a lot of rough stuff going on before. People called Ronald Reagan an extremist. Yeah. So there was some rough stuff before.
Mark Shields is going to join us in a moment. He's up there in New Hampshire. And hey, Mark, can you hear me?
Hey, Jim,
Hey, we were having audio problems. Did you hear what? Weigh in on the mean question, please, sir. Did you hear that? Is this
I haven't able to.
All right. Question I just asked Paul is this. It's the word today is this is the meanest New Hampshire primary in recent history. Do you agree?
Boy, there've been some mean ones, but it's been mean. It's been tough. It's one of the few times, Jim, where I've seen candidates out in front go after those behind them. Usually the negative is somebody going after somebody up front to bring them back to the field. Mm-hmm. But Senator Dole certainly spent a good part as the front runner of the last week, pointing out the character, biographical, and moral defects of Lamar Alexander and Pat Buchanan.
Yeah. Mark, in general terms, as the people are voting now, or most of them have already voted, is it fair to say that the people of New Hampshire got a good, square, clean look at these candidates?
I think they got a good look. I mean, I think New Hampshire probably reasserted itself as the principal place where these decisions are going to be made, rightly or wrongly. The two candidates who flirted with other states, Phil Graham, the senator from Texas flirted with Arizona and Delaware, and Steve Forbes went to Delaware, and in both cases it redounded to their detriment. Mr. Graham never made it to New Hampshire, but New Hampshire voters take this responsibility very seriously. I mean, in spite of the negativeness of the campaign or whatever else, the turnout today looks to be pretty impressive.
But Paul, the question is, did the people see the real Steve Forbes and what he stands for, the real Bob Dole and what he stands for, the real Lamar Alexander, et cetera, and on down the line? Was it at the retail level and other levels? Did they see the real candidate?
Well, this New Hampshire primary was less retail in that door-to-door sense that has grown up in New Hampshire lore than other New Hampshire primaries. There was more of it on television. There were more staged events than in the past. There was less interaction with average voters, but there was still a lot more of all of that than you'll get in most other places. And I think Mark is right that New Hampshire has still reasserted itself as a very good vetting ground, and particularly in a Republican primary. I mean, you can fit the Democrats in New Hampshire in a phone booth, but at the Republican primary level, this is a pretty good test of the Republican electorate. It's a diverse enough electorate, and I think they got to size up the candidates pretty well.
What about the Republican Party and the test of the Republican Party of its extremes and what it stands for and what it doesn't stand for and what these candidates stand for? Mark, how would you rate that in terms of what came out in New Hampshire?
Well, I think, Jim, that the Republicans have a problem. They are the anti-government party, just as the Democrats have been historically the pro-government party. And when your theme is anti-government, and you've spent a good part of 1995 really delegitimizing what government has done in the past in the areas of the environment or education or health and safety, it becomes a liability to have governmental experience. I mean, here's Bob Dole, who by any measurement has a long, distinguished legislative career. And somehow up here, last Friday night at the Christian Coalition meeting, where Elizabeth Dole, his wife, substituted for him, she went to great lengths to emphasize that in 1979, Bob Dole had opposed the creation of the Department of Education. Everybody else is calling for its abolition now, including Lamar Alexander, who was its secretary. But I mean, I think that has, it's intriguing that Dick Lugar, who was a respected United States senator, it's almost like he was carrying a burden because he had been a public servant.
How do you feel about that, Paul?
There's a lot of hostility in the Republican Party to what's been going on in Washington. And to be identified with the welfare state that's been built up over 30 years is no great asset in the Republican Party. There's no question about it. I think the problems that have erupted, though, in New Hampshire and the Republican Party are a little different. I think the fissures between the economic and the social conservatives that began, you saw a little bit in Iowa, have been exacerbated in New Hampshire with Buchanan. Phil Gramm was a candidate who could appeal to both, but ended up appealing not very much to either. Bob Dole is somebody who could appeal to both, but his weakness has tended to create openings for first Steve Forbes to speak for the economic conservatives, now Pat Buchanan for the cultural conservatives. So you have those divisions, I think, showing up a lot more sharply than they have in previous Republican contests.
Yeah. Mark, we don't know the results yet, so it's we're not even Shields and Gigot are going to talk about the results until we have them. But it's safe to say at this point that there's going to be at least 3, possibly 4 candidates to continue very strongly coming out of this, right? If it runs as closely at the top as it appears to, all of the polls going in say, in other words, Dole, Buchanan, and Alexander are definitely going to be there. Maybe Forbes. Lugar will probably stay as well. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know what Senator Lugar will do, Jim, but I think we're reaching the point where moral victories don't count for much, and better than expecteds are no longer satisfactory on a losing election night. I think if Senator Dole were to win New Hampshire, it's a big victory for him.
Even if he wins by just a hair.
Even if he wins by a hair. Pat Buchanan is not going to go away. I mean, Pat Buchanan was interesting after his good showing in Iowa, came in here and got intense scrutiny, oftentimes hostile scrutiny from his opponents and from many in the press this past week. And it may very well have stalled his candidacy here and a chance that if he doesn't win, I think that the past week probably would account for it. Yeah. Lamar Alexander got less of that. He will get more, especially, I think, on his personal finances in the weeks ahead. But I think that the problem is going to be that Buchanan doesn't need money, and Alexander does. Yeah. And I think that's the difference. I think Buchanan can keep going on the land and coach tickets and a rip and read off a UPI wire ticker. That's the kind of campaign he has.
You agree, Paul, that that Dole, Alexander, and Buchanan are going to go on from New Hampshire. They, for sure, whether Forbes and Lugar and the others do is up for grabs. But the first three are not.
If Lamar Alexander is close enough to the first two to credibly say, I have a chance to win some of the primaries, he's definitely going to go on. In particular, if Bob Dole loses here. Then I think it's wide open. Steve Forbes has the money to go on elsewhere. He's got an awful lot of money, close to $1 million invested in New York, and that arcane primary maze that Al D'Amato has set up there. He's on the ballot there, so he's going to be loath to get out before then.
All right. Well, thank you, and we'll. Yeah, I'm sorry, Mark. We got to go. We got to go, and we'll pick up this discussion at 10 o'clock Eastern Time on most of these public television stations tonight after the results are known. Thank you all very much. Now, the governors came to Washington today with a plan to reform welfare. Charlene Hunter-Gault has the story.
One of the biggest fights in this year's budget battle has been and remains over welfare reform. In the latest round, two of the nation's governors, a Republican and a Democrat, went to Capitol Hill today to try and sell their proposed bipartisan solution. Kwame Holman begins our report.
The governors wrote their welfare plan during several days of meetings in Washington 2 weeks ago and adopted it unanimously. Today, two of the principal authors of the plan, Republican Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin and Democrat Tom Carper of Delaware, brought their plan to the House Ways and Means Subcommittee on Human Resources, the committee charged with turning it into legislation. Republican Clay Shaw is subcommittee chairman.
This current welfare system is a tragedy. It saps the strength of our fellow citizens who find themselves on welfare. It destroys their dreams for tomorrow, and it takes away their hope for today. Allowing it to continue without change, which is the only hope of the liberals who oppose the bipartisan governor's plan, would be a farce. For the sake of both the poor and for the taxpayers, let's not let that happen.
The governor's plan is similar to a welfare reform plan already approved by Congress but vetoed by President Clinton last month. Both plans would end the current entitlement status of aid to families with dependent children and curtail spending on other federal assistance programs. But the governors would set aside $15 billion over 7 years for child care, $4 billion more than was offered by Congress. The governor's plan also would make a $2 billion emergency fund available to states during an economic downturn. That's double what Congress passed. Federal assistance money, including funding for the food stamp program, would be distributed through block grants, allowing each state to design its own programs, but with some federal restrictions. As in the congressional welfare bill, adults would be required to find work within 2 years. But the governor's plan would allow states to exempt from the work requirement parents with a child under age 1 and limit the work requirement to 20 hours a week for parents with a child under age 6. States also could count up to 12 weeks of job search and training as fulfilling the work requirement. As in the congressional bill, states could restrict benefits for additional children born to families already on welfare. And states also would receive bonuses for reducing the number of out-of-wedlock births. But Democrat Harold Ford of Tennessee told the governors their plan is too restrictive and questioned how they would protect the youngest welfare recipients while requiring their parents to go to work.
And we're talking about block granting or handing over to the states billions of dollars. Where are the checks and balances that we can check to see whether or not your performance is good, whether or not children are being protected here? We want to make sure that welfare recipients become self-sufficient, as you said earlier, of the government. However, we want to make sure that the 10 million children who are on welfare are in fact protected, and women who are able to work, if they need the proper training and education, that we provide that. I don't want my governor in my state to look at a welfare proposal in your state and think for some strange reason, because you've had great success stories in your two counties, that I, in my hometown or my state, would have those same success stories.
All of us are concerned across this country, Democrats and Republicans alike, for children, for the poor, for the sick, for the elderly. We think as governors, Democrats and Republicans alike, that we can do a much better job if you give us the flexibility. One size does not fit all. Wisconsin is not like Delaware. It is not like Tennessee. Give me the opportunity to set up a program that works in Wisconsin and moves people off of welfare into work. Set some federal standards, some general standards that we have to comply with, and come back year after year if you want to, and see whether or not we're hitting that bar. And I'll assure you, just as I'm sitting here, we will surpass those bars. And we will be able to demonstrate to you and to all members up there that we can do a better job if we have the flexibility and the opportunity to set up individual programs in our respective states, be you a Democrat or Republican.
Republican Phil English of Pennsylvania wondered if the governor's plan is restrictive enough.
What you have proposed, as I understand it, is that you are shooting for a more modest work participation requirement, moving toward 25 hours per week. And I wonder, do you believe that that could be legitimately criticized as weak on work, or do you believe you can take this provision and run with it?
A lot of the people that we're trying to move from welfare to work don't have much education. A lot of them dropped out of high school. What we're doing in my state, when somebody shows up at a welfare office, we're not interested in saying, we want to spend 2 years or 4 years training you to be ready to go to work. We want to try to get them to work right away. Sometimes the best training a person can get is actually on the job. And what we anticipate doing while people are working, getting into work, maybe they go to work at McDonald's, maybe they're flipping hamburgers, but the idea is not for them to continue to flip hamburgers for the next 20 years. The idea is for them to get the skills on the job and maybe going to school part-time so that they become the night manager, or maybe eventually the day manager, and eventually maybe own their own franchise themselves. That should be what we're about.
The governors urged Congress to move quickly to turn their welfare reform plan into legislation, even though the Clinton administration has yet to take a position on the governor's welfare blueprint.
The opposition to the plan comes from both the right and the left, and that's the fight we try and join now. Here to defend their plan are two governors, Republican Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin, chairman of the National Governors Association, and Democratic Governor Gaston Caperton, who is with us from Charleston, West Virginia. In the opposition corner, on the right, we have Christy Hamrick of the Family Research Council, and on the left, from Schenectady, New York, we have Teresa Funicello, an author of books on the welfare system and a former welfare recipient. Coming back to you, Ms. Hamrick, what is your overall objection to the governor's proposal?
Well, the answer to a failed federal welfare system with a bloated bureaucracy and programs that have institutionalized bad incentives. I'll give you more money if you don't marry, if you don't name the father of your children, if you have more children, if you don't work. All these incentives in place with money tied to them. And so we say, look, this program is broken down, we need to fix it. And instead, the answer to that can't be, all right, we're going to take all that money and in fact add a little bit more, send lump sums back to the states without restrictions, and in fact not deal with the heart, which is an incentive system. I think that we're overlooking the fact that the American people are a compassionate people. They want to truly help. But the system itself has built in incentives for the kind of behavior which is killing them, which is killing a society.
All right, that's your overall. Now give me one specific example of something within the program that you think one of the major problems with it.
The major problem is the philosophy. In the contract with America and with all the welfare proposals today, we have said illegitimacy, dealing with that behavior, is the core to understanding why our system is breaking down. We are giving you money for not marrying, for not forming strong families. We are not helping families stay together. We're not sticking with the heart. You know, the most effective exit from welfare has been marriage. And yet, what does this program do? Does it build marriage-strengthening policies? Does it say, look, we're going to deal with the behavior, out-of-wedlock births that are really causing this problem? No, it says, we're going to set up child care centers. We're going to take women with young children and focus on them getting into the workforce rather than dealing with workfare for men or women with older children. Again, we're dealing with bad incentives, but now they're at the state level rather than the federal.
Governor Thompson, how do you respond to that? You heard the whole thing, so I won't repeat it. You're sitting here.
But no, I think a lot of the things Christina said are very true, and I'm not going to argue with her. But isn't it beautiful in Washington, D.C., that you have people from the Democrat side and the Republican side coming together on a bipartisan approach on welfare reform, and yet we're being criticized from people on the left and the right. So I think we're probably correct. When you have people opposing us from both sides, we're able to come through the middle and say we have a bipartisan. What I differ from Christine basically is she wants to set some national standards and then I believe give the flexibility back to the states to implement them. I say give it to the states. We're in a much better position to be able to come up with better programs and be able to take people off of welfare, be able to hopefully hold down an illegitimacy, help to bring family units together, and be able to collect child support and get people to work. These are the kinds of things that governors are doing all over this country. We're the ones that are coming up with innovative ideas that will help people get off of welfare.
Governor Caberton, in West Virginia, you had anything to add to that?
Well, I think that what we've really emphasized as governors is we want flexibility, but yet we want the government to be a federal partner to give us some guarantees in case of bad turns in the economy. I think what we all have to remember is that the President has been one of the real leaders in welfare reform, that governors have to deal with this every day, and they want welfare reform. No one likes the system as it is today, and we're only going to have a good system if we come together in some sort of compromise, and that's what the national governors have done. And I think that we've come up with a good plan that, as you've shown on this show, that is criticized from the far left and the far right, but I think we've got a very good plan and a good start. Now, the most complicated part about this is what we're going to do about getting people to work. That's the real challenge of this.
All right, well, let's get back to that in a moment, but Ms. Hamrick, let me just ask you, how do you like what you've heard in response to your criticism?
I would like it better if we were dealing with the problem rather than the funding source. I mean, the issue is not whether or not the money should be federal money or state money. Frankly, if the governors were willing to say, look, we are better acquainted with it. Let's cut out the taxes that are taken to the federal level. Let's just reduce federal taxes. And at the state level, let's have full accountability. Let's have full control. But that's not what's being said. We're removing accountability from the people. The money is going from them to the federal government with no strings to the state. And we're not saying, look, for our money, we would like some assurances that the lives that are being destroyed in a system that breaks down the family, it needs to be rebuilt. We need to rebuild this system rather than just saying the answer is no strings on the cash.
Just a brief response, Governor.
The system has failed. This is the best vehicle to make a monumental change in welfare as we know it in our society. Give us the chance. Don't stop it. And unless this package passes, I don't see anything out there. You can talk about all those wonderful theories, but unless you change the law, we still have the same failed system.
All right, let me just hear briefly from Ms. Funicello, your overall reaction to the plan.
Well, this is a classic case of throwing the baby out instead of the bathwater. We're passing the bureaucracy on from Washington to the states. That's lovely. But the one piece of the money that used to be, or up until now anyway, guaranteed to go into the pockets of poor people, which is the smallest amount of the welfare system, is now up for grabs.
And that is?
That is the AFDC money. If the governors reduce entitlements or people are cut off for various reasons, that money is what governors are asking to have made available to them, in effect, to distribute as patronage, which is where most of the money already goes. This is a redistribution scheme from poor people to middle-class professionals who will receive the government contracts that become available as a consequence. It's truly depressing.
Governor Caperton, can you respond to that?
I don't concur with that. I think what this bill that the governors have agreed upon is one that emphasizes work, that recognizes the importance of health care, care of children, and focuses on education and personal responsibility. I think that those are the right principles, and I think they'll work. I don't think we're going to get an answer on this on either the far extreme left or the far extreme right. I think we've got to come together and do what makes good common sense. Be sure we have a program that creates flexibility and one that has federal guarantees so the federal government continues to be a partner.
Governor Thompson, to her specific complaint that this takes money away from the people who need it the most and gives it to middle-class people, or it becomes a patronage scheme because there's presumably no checks on the governors and how they spend the money, how do you respond to that?
Absolutely incorrect.
I agree with that. I don't agree with her. She's correct either.
I mean, she's absolutely stating a falsehood. That is not true.
Why
the states right now are getting waivers. The states right now have the opportunity to set different levels on welfare in all 50 states. The states right now have flexibility to do things in order to be able to contract out. What we're trying to do is change the system. We're trying to move people from welfare, a dependent society, into one of independence. We're trying to allow people to have an opportunity to improve themselves. People on welfare are in poverty. We're trying to improve that.
Ms. Funicello, he says they both say you're just not right.
Well, I don't know any governor who would say I am right, but that doesn't change reality. The reality of politics is that if you have control over money, what you do with it, if you can, is distribute it in patronage, and I didn't make that up. That's just the way things are.
Are there checks on this money,
Absolutely,
Governor Thompson?
there are checks on it.
That's exactly what governors are trying to escape, the checks. That's why they don't want a federal entitlement. That's what they started out saying.
She's absolutely wrong. She doesn't even understand what the governors are trying to do.
Where are the checks, Governor?
The checks are throughout the whole system. We have
to make sure that the money gets to the right.
Absolutely. We have to make sure that people are taken care of.
That's what you're trying to escape.
We have to make sure. What we're trying to do is get flexibility at the state level so we can administer the program.
The federal entiment.
Why should the federal government? The problem is that one size fits all does not work. There are different problems in Wisconsin versus West Virginia versus Delaware versus California. What we're trying to do is develop a system that is more efficient, more effective, to help people get off of welfare. I would think she would be supportive of that. I think most people that look at the system say it has failed. It is time to change it, and that's what the governors are trying to do.
Ms. Hamrick, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, one of the problems, though, in terms of helping people get off welfare is that we're targeting the wrong people. President Clinton started with a very failed idea that the most important group to target are women with the youngest children, that's the group to weigh in on. And the governor's proposal also targets women with young children. And so we put beside a failed federal welfare system a possible failed federal daycare system. The research is clear that young children need their mothers and that mothers wish to take care of their children. One of our concerns, one of the pro-family concerns, is that at the very least, let's target men. Let's target women with older children rather than institutionalizing with more money a new failed and possible federal daycare system.
Governor Thompson, let me just get Governor Thompson in on this.
Well, we want to try and change the whole system. We want to try and make sure that we are able to hold families together. We're trying to make sure that children are given ample daycare.
But
that's where the $4 billion, we got $4 billion of additional money for child care.
But that's the problem.
And we're trying to give the skills necessary for people to get off of welfare. People forget that people on welfare are in poverty. We're trying to improve their lot in life. We're trying to keep families together.
There is $4 billion in there for child care.
Absolutely, but the problem is that they've put all this attention. They're saying in the proposal, our goal is to increase daycare services, to increase daycare spending, when we know already that parent care would be better than daycare. And frankly, why isn't that money going to help jobs for the older people, for the men who need to support families, and for older women and their with older
Ms. Funicello, you wanted to weigh in?
Yes, men are not on AFDC, and so you can't really do much about men by changing AFDC. We're suffering from extraordinary levels of national cognitive dissonance. Mothering is good. Mothers who try to do it ought to be punished. Work is the necessary solution, but there are no jobs. There's no way out. The governors say they're not trying to distribute more patronage, but the only new money in this budget is precisely to distribute in contracts one way or another for what they call child care. But that's what mothers do.
Governor, let me get Governor Caputo to respond to that.
Well, first of all, this child care is a problem that goes beyond just poor mothers, but we've got to give mothers that want to work and need to work an opportunity to be sure their children get good daycare. And that's what we're trying to do. I think it's extremely important. And I support that part of this 100%.
But it's the targeting here. The problem here is the targeting. Rather than working on the foundation, which is broken families, which is a system that rewards you when the men leave, when more children enter a very fractured household. We're not targeting the building up of families. We're not targeting marriage, which is a family strengthening proposal with, for example, red fare. We're not targeting family cap issues, which says you're not going to get an automatic raise if you have more children. Instead, we're targeting a new bureaucracy. It's a new child care
18 states have put family caps on right now. 18 states have put family caps on. And you know, here, I listen to these arguments. They're still arguing for the status quo. And everybody knows that the system has failed. The governors are stepping forward on a bipartisan basis and saying, let's change it. Let's help people get people off of welfare. And yet we get criticized.
All right, Ms. Funicello, let me just ask you briefly, what would you have the governors do that they're not doing now?
Well, certainly it isn't giving poor people money, which is a problem. We give money to all kinds of people. Less than 1% of the federal budget is what goes in money to poor people. 99% of the federal budget is redistributed to other people. But
so is there a way to fix this so that there can be a compromise for welfare reform this time around?
There certainly is. And in fact, that way was proposed by President Nixon, in the Family Assistance Plan, which said, let's just give a guaranteed annual income to people, cut out the bureaucracy, and go on from there, as we do with Social Security. But underneath all this is not just an attack on AFDC and the children on AFDC, although that ought to be enough to concern people. But this is a sub rosa attack on entitlements completely, including Social Security. That's where the money is. And sooner or later, that's what people are going to hear. They need to wake up and listen now. I want to hear about justice. I want to hear about compassion. I'm tired of all this send the mothers to work.
Briefly, Governor Thompson, you see room for compromise in there?
We have already compromised. I mean, we have gone a great distance in trying to reach an agreement with 50 governors. And this is a bipartisan approach with all the governors supporting it, liberals and conservatives alike, to change the system for the better. And we say, give us an opportunity.
Mr. Hamrick, what would you have the governors do that they're not doing now? And let's get a reaction from them briefly.
Make building up families the #1 priority, not building new systems or not merely redistributing the money, but actually targeting the goal of having men involved in their families' lives, having mothers with young children have better skills.
Governor Caperton, with critics like this on the right and the left, how do you assess the chances of getting a welfare reform bill this year?
Well, I've found that usually when you get the criticism from the far left and the far right, you're probably in a pretty good place. I think we put together an extremely good program, very bipartisan, both of us giving a lot to get where we are. But I think it gives us the flexibility and the guarantees we need, and I think that it has most everything the president has asked for.
Right.
It's got work, it's got health care, it's got children's care, and it's got personal responsibility. I think we're moving in the right direction.
Governor Thompson, chance for success this year?
Wisconsin, we sort of led the way. We've been able to reduce the welfare caseload by 1/3.
So you'll get a bill this year, you think?
I'm sure we will.
Well, thank you all for joining us.
Finally tonight, the U.S. Supreme Court takes up the Rodney King case. Elizabeth Farnsworth has that story.
The issue before the Supreme Court today was whether a trial judge properly reduced mandatory prison terms for the 2 officers convicted in the Los Angeles beating case. We begin with this backgrounder from Jeffrey Kay of public station KCET in Los Angeles.
Los Angeles erupted in flames in 1992 after 4 police officers were acquitted in state court of unlawfully beating Rodney King. 1 year later, authorities braced for more disturbances as 2 of the officers were acquitted and 2 convicted on federal charges of violating King's civil rights. The city remained calm, but the case sparked a legal battle over the nation's federal sentencing system. Lawrence Powell and Stacy Kuhn were sentenced to 30 months in prison, far short of the 70 to 87-month range which prosecutors maintain were mandated by federal sentencing guidelines.
The government argued vigorously for its position. We are disappointed by the downward departures imposed today.
While Kuhn and Powell served out their prison terms, prosecutors appealed. They argued, and an appellate court agreed, that the judge should have stuck to the guidelines, a set of rules which set sentences based on types of crimes and criminal records. Hoping to avoid more prison time, the former police officers took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, actually, there's a lot more at stake in this case than even just the Rodney King case.
According to law professor Laurie Levinson, this case could also determine how much discretion federal judges have in sentencing.
Frankly, when the Supreme Court took this case, they decided to take a look at the sentencing guidelines. And there's a great deal of controversy about those guidelines. The question boils down to this. Should trial judges, judges like Judge Davies, have broad or narrow discretion in sentencing people under the guidelines?
Judge John Davies ruled that because this was a unique case, he could depart from the guidelines. Davies concluded King had provoked his own beating by refusing to comply with the officer's orders and by trying to evade arrest. He also said that because of their notoriety, Kuhn and Powell had suffered by losing their jobs and might undergo further punishment in prison by abusive inmates. Powell's lawyer, William Copany, defends the judge's decision. He says Powell and Kuhn have been in constant fear for their lives.
What the judge focused on was their punishment would be harder. They would be worried, they would either have to be kept in protective custody, which would be much more difficult than being in a general population prison, or they would have to, every day of their life, every minute of their life in prison, suffer the psychological concern of, am I going to be stabbed in the back?
Copany says the judge's so-called downward departure from the guidelines was justified by the unusual circumstances of the case.
I think what Judge Davies did is say, they're going to have to do harder time than another person in their position, so I'm going to make them do less of it. And that, it seems to me, to be a very rational basis for concluding that the sentence, a downward departure, should be granted. And the government can't point to any statute or case law or any reason that that reasoning could not be employed by a district judge. It makes it a unique case, too.
But U.S. Attorney Nora Minella argues that this was a typical police brutality case, and no special dispensation should be allowed because of its notoriety.
As to the fact that it was a notorious case, we certainly wouldn't want to create a discount for people simply because their behavior was so offensive that it caused outrage throughout the entire world. As to the likelihood of additional punishment in prison, again, we don't create discounts for people whose offenses are so bad that they may even offend their fellow inmates. If we were to give a discount on that basis, we would be giving discounts to child molesters who are notoriously unpopular in prison. We'd be giving discounts to gang members who might be subject to retaliation from rival gang members. That's simply not an appropriate basis for discounting a sentence.
Prosecutors also say the judge should have disregarded King's initial combative behavior because King was beaten after he offered no resistance. But beyond the specifics of this case is the debate over how defendants are sentenced. The complex federal sentencing guidelines were established in 1987 by a commission created by Congress to reduce disparities in sentences for defendants with similar criminal records who commit similar crimes. Since then, Congress has also passed additional laws establishing tough minimum sentences for particular crimes. Judges are allowed to go outside the guidelines in unusual cases, but many judges complain that too often inflexible rules prevent them from evaluating cases on their merits.
I'm frustrated. I know my colleagues are frustrated too, because one of the reasons for these so-called guidelines, and I will always refer to them as so-called, is that they're not guidelines, they're mandates, and they effectively take away our discretion entirely.
Los Angeles District Court Judge Terry Hatter says, as an example, he has had to sentence small-time drug dealers to life in prison because they had prior convictions. But when major narcotics traffickers came before him, under the guidelines, he was forced to give lighter sentences because those defendants had no criminal records.
If I could not give them the maximum, what kind of a message does that send? So there's frustration at the top and at the bottom with these so-called guidelines.
And so with these big-time drug dealers,
yes.
you were forced to give them a sentence that was no higher than someone who might be dealing a smaller amount.
Far less, as a matter of fact.
The Kuhn and Powell case is being closely watched by the U.S. Sentencing Commission, the independent agency which formulated the guidelines for Congress and which regularly makes modifications with congressional approval. The Commission's General Counsel, John Steer, told reporter Allison Aubrey that the guidelines are doing what Congress intended, and that is to impose greater uniformity in sentencing.
I think it's fair to say that Congress likes the concept of a tough guideline system, an appropriately tough guideline system, and one in which judges sentence within the guidelines a high percentage of the time. I think there would be some concern, though, about increased disparity if the court rules that, for the defendants in this case, and rules very broadly.
A broad ruling for the defendants would allow judges to impose lighter or heavier prison sentences as they wish. If the justices rule for the government, the former police officers will be back in court for resentencing.
For more on today's Supreme Court hearing, we're joined by Stuart Taylor, correspondent for the American Lawyer and Legal Times and a regular on the NewsHour. Welcome, Stuart. What was happening in 1984 that caused Congress to want these guidelines, to begin the process of drawing up the guidelines?
There was a lot of criticism at that time that the traditional method of criminal sentencing, which is letting the judge decide what he thinks is the appropriate sentence based out of a huge range of possibilities, was leading to wild disparities all over the country, depending not so much on the nature of the crime or the criminal as on the judge. Soft judges were giving light sentences to people who did terrible things. Hard, tough judges were giving heavy sentences to people who did less serious things. And there was a convergence of liberal reformers who didn't like these disparities, and conservatives who were worried about some judges mollycoddling criminals, came together and said, let's have some uniformity. Let's tie these judges down to some guidelines so that the sentence doesn't depend on who the judge is.
And how do the guidelines work? They're very complicated, according to Jeff's piece.
That principle was carried to very detailed specification initially by Congress, but in more detail by the Sentencing Commission that Congress created, of how much the sentence ought to be for every one of the zillion crimes in the Federal Criminal Code, and then with adjustments upwards for the criminal record. And the embodiment of it all is this grid, which is actually what a federal judge is supposed to use when he passes sentence. You look at the offense level, and in Rodney, in this case, for example, these two police officers, they said we start with 6 because they violated the civil rights of Rodney King, and then
so
we
it's
add
all reduced
15.
to numbers.
Right, we add 15, and that's the complaint a lot of judges have, is they've taken the human element out of sentencing. Some judges complain they've reduced it all to a numbers game. We aren't supposed to be computers. This is too rigid. That's part of the background.
Do you have any sense that most judges don't like the guidelines? Is there any research on that?
There's been a lot of anecdotal material and a lot of resolutions passed by various judicial bodies over time indicating, although the judges tend to be a little bit wary of taking public positions on this, I have the sense that there's very widespread unhappiness among federal judges about this, and not limited to the Democratic-appointed Carter and Clinton judges who one thinks might be more sympathetic to criminal defendants. I've talked to a lot of Reagan-appointed judges, former prosecutors, who think these guidelines are too inflexible and often too harsh.
And that's really what this case is about, whether they are too inflexible?
Not exactly. This case is about how inflexible they are. The Supreme Court is being called upon in this case to decide whether the guidelines allow judges a fair amount of freedom to depart from the guidelines and give a lesser, or for that matter, a greater sentence based on what they think are unusual factors in the case, or whether the judges are really obliged to stick to the numbers rigidly, except in the most extraordinary cases. In this case, for example, Judge John Davies, who sentenced the two police officers for beating Rodney King, gave them a much lesser sentence than the guidelines would have called for because of a bunch of factors.
How much less? Let's get that clear.
He gave them each 2.5 years, and if he just stuck to the guideline sentence, he would have given them more like 6 or 7 years. And
Jeff explained why he did that, the various factors that led him to do that.
Yes, and then the Federal Appeals Court, which heard the case on appeal by the prosecution, said that Judge Davies had erred, that he had misapplied the law, and that all of the reasons he had given for departing downward from the guideline sentence were invalid. That the defendants in turn, who have now been released from prison and would have to go back for a long time if they lose, have appealed to the Supreme Court to try and avoid that.
And what happened in the Supreme Court today?
The court made it clear, the various justices in their questions, that they see this case as an important question that involves thousands and thousands of cases, and that they're less concerned about what happens to these two former police officers than they are about the precedent they set and how it will affect many other cases. Justice Breyer, for example, said at one point, "I'm more concerned about the general principle here than about the facts of the case, because this will affect thousands and thousands of cases, 50,000 a year," he said. It's less clear who's going to win. This case was harder to read than a lot of them in terms of some of the justices gave hard questions to each side and didn't really show how they were leaning with any clarity.
You couldn't tell at all from what was said.
I wouldn't bet money on the outcome of this case. I thought that some of the justices, in particular Justice Breyer and Justice Souter, seemed sympathetic to the police officers, the defendants' arguments that judges should have fairly broad discretion to depart downward from the guidelines as was done in this case, but that they weren't necessarily buying that argument across the board, because the judge here cited a whole bunch of different factors for departing downward, and it sounded like some of the justices might be more persuaded by some of them than by others.
And Justice Breyer actually helped write the guidelines, didn't he?
He had an important hand, both when Congress drafted the Reform Act in 1984, he was the senior staffer on the Judiciary Committee working for Senator Kennedy, who had a very important role in drafting them, and then he was one of the first members of the Sentencing Commission and had a very important role in drafting the guidelines themselves. Then as a federal appellate judge before he joined the Supreme Court, he decided some of the more important precedents. So he comes to this case with a lot of experience in the matter.
This is an unusual case, isn't it, in that the issue of judicial discretion with the guidelines is often championed by lawyers for criminal defendants and not so often by police officers who want them to be applied right down the line, and yet here are the police officers making that argument.
It is an irony of this case. In fact, there are two police organizations that are friends of the court in this case, backing up the police officers, and they are making the same argument that the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers is making, which is that the important general principle in this case is that judges ought to be able to show mercy to depart downward from the guideline sentence in a fairly wide variety of cases. And it is odd to see police officers arguing that principle, but of course, when police officers are defendants, they see things the way other defendants do.
And you said that Stacey Kuhn and Lawrence Powell are now out of prison. For how long might they go back if the case is decided against them?
They could go back for 4 or 5 years, depending on, if they lose on every issue across the board, they'll probably do at least 4 more years. They've served a little over 2 years now. They got out early on their 2.5-year sentences because of good behavior in prison, and they do face the prospect of going back for a long time.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.
Again, the major story of this Tuesday was Pat Buchanan's apparent stunning victory in the New Hampshire primary. Senator Bob Dole running second, Lamar Alexander third, Steve Forbes fourth. All 4 television networks have projected the Buchanan victory, but here are the latest numbers with 60% of the votes in. Buchanan with 27%, Dole 26%, Alexander 23%, Forbes 12%. We'll see you at 10 o'clock tonight with full analysis of these results and others, and we'll be back, of course, tomorrow night at our regular time, also with full analysis of the New Hampshire primary results. I'm Jim Lara. Thank you and good night.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lara has been provided by the Archer Daniels Midland Company, ADM, supermarket to the world. And by New York Life, yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
For all the latest world, national, and Northwest regional news, plus features and some fun, join OPB Radio for Morning Edition tomorrow from 3 until 9 a.m.
Video cassettes of the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.
Funding for local broadcast of the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer has been provided by a grant from ODS Health Plans, the group medical plans that meet the needs of Oregonians by providing a broad range of medical and dental coverage and responsive service. And by the Oregon Trawl Commission, family-owned businesses catching your seafood for you, supporting research and management of a public resource.
Next time on Frontline, the media feeding frenzy on the Michael Jackson story.
We practice a form of checkbook journalism, but so does everybody else.
Frontline examines the impact of the tabloids on American journalism in Tabloid Truth.
On OPB, tonight at 9.
Well, that OPB forecast for tonight shaping up like this. Eastern areas of Oregon could see a